never dreamed that one day down in Alabama,
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty.
I guess I really don't know what Christmas is all about. Isn't there anyone who knows what Christmas is all about? Sure, Charlie Brown. I can tell you what Christmas is all about.
You tell them I'm coming, and hell's coming with me, you hear? Hell's coming with me!
Hello, this is Michael Hart, and you're listening to Unknown America, Myths and Little-Known Oddities about the greatest nation on Earth, on the Heart of America Broadcasting Network. We have got so much to talk about today. You know, in the book,
The belief that the rights of man
Reason,
come not from the generosity of the state, but...
Philosopher, writer, and essayist George Santayana famously penned the words, "Those that cannot remember the past are indeed condemned to repeat it." What Santayana was referring to is the failures that occur when people do not learn from their past mistakes and continue in their very misguided ways, and in a larger sense, the tragedies that can occur when societies fail to learn, buries the truth of past mistakes, ignores or revises atrocities, or even worse, simply forgets. Over the last several centuries, whether through human error, false reporting, or simple neglect, history has all too often been a victim of forgetfulness or, in many cases, revision. While this program is chock full of historical trivia, and many people have either forgotten it, never knew it, or were never taught it, it also serves to set the record straight by smashing some of the most enduring myths and outright lies that have persisted through the history of America. During this show, you're going to learn some things about the most famous Americans that shaped this nation, as well as people you may never have heard of that the history books either ignored, whose stories were forgotten, altered, or considered not worth telling until now. Also, during this program, you can learn some pretty fascinating facts about the American culture and even some about the little-known oddities of the American experience. Simply stated, there's a lot of history in the past, and unfortunately, too much of it's ignored, changed to fit a narrative, or deemed not worthy of being taught. So prepare to be amazed while you learn some of the most fascinating people, places, plans, and peculiarities that make up the unknown America. And on today's program, we're going to take a trip into the past and explore the unknown Black history. Let me explain a little bit more about this. The retelling of history is often a challenging and very tricky task. Whether through time or negligence, stories are frequently embellished, misreported, attributed incorrectly, or deemed unworthy of being told, or just their telling avoided altogether. While this phenomenon is not unique to any one ethnic group, it does seem to plague the Black race disproportionately, considering the significance of the contribution members of the Black community have made when compared to the relatively smaller percentage that make up the U.S. population. And for this reason, this is the reason we have included the Unknown Black History in the Unknown America book and the Unknown America broadcast. I am a firm believer, matter of fact, I know it in my bone marrow, that a good bit of the problems that we see in this country today are not only a lack of understanding of the way government works or the world works or what our history is all about. People just don't know the truth of many of the most enduring beliefs in all of America. And today, in the next hour or so, we are going to pack this program in with a lot of information that people just might not be aware of, that is going to perhaps shed a little bit of light on the events of the day. That is the whole pretext of Unknown America. It's not just a bathroom reader where you can sit around for 4 or 5 minutes reading vignettes and learn a little bit about America. If you don't understand this country's past, then many of the narratives of today simply don't make sense. And when you hear some of this or read some of it, you're going to realize that there is a lot out there that does not make sense until you know the truth. let's just jump right in, and I'm going to keep this as close to the historical timeline as I possibly can. There's a lot of moving parts and a lot of stuff I want to cover today. Inoculation, vaccines, was introduced to America by a slave. Very few details are known about the birth of a slave named Onesimus, but it is assumed he was born in Africa in the late 17th century before eventually landing in Boston. Onesimus was actually a gift to the Puritan church minister Cotton Mather from his congregation in 1706. While in Mather's possession, Onesimus told him about the centuries-old tradition of inoculation practiced in Africa. By extracting material from an infected person and scratching it into the skin of an uninfected person, you could deliberately introduce smallpox, in this case, to the healthy individual, making them immune. This was obviously considered extremely dangerous at the time, and Mather convinced a guy by the name of Dr. Zabdiel Boyston to experiment with the procedure when a smallpox epidemic hit Boston in 1721. At least 240 people were inoculated using the Onesimus technique, and opposed for political, religious, and medical reasons. Public reaction to the experiment put Mather and Boylston's lives in danger, despite records proving that only 2% of inoculated patients died compared to 15% of not inoculated against the disease. The traditional African-American practice brought to America by Onesimus was used to inoculate American soldiers during the Revolutionary War and introduced the concept of inoculation to the new nation. Interestingly enough, there's been a lot of contributions from the black community into the medical fields. For example, Charles Drew was the first African-American to earn a Doctor's of Medical Science degree, but he actually heavily impacted the medical field of his time and today. It was actually Charles Drew that was responsible for the establishment of blood banks, and he developed a way to process and store blood plasma. He also led the blood banks of the United States and Great Britain. He did refuse to do so after a law passed calling for the segregation of the blood of African Americans. I want to pause right here momentarily and make folks understand that although we're going to pack a lot into this time today, by no stretch of the imagination are we going to be able to get to everybody that I thought you might find interesting as it relates to the contributions of the black community to the American experience. So my omission of any one particular person is not an admission in any form whatsoever that their contributions should be lessened. That's why, although there is an entire book dedicated, there's another book and another book already in the works, because there is an awful lot of history in the past. One of the debates that has plagued this nation for the greatest period of time, and we are seeing it play out in real time across America, whether we're talking about any of the hashtag movements or some of the recent tragedies that have occurred, discussions of bigotry and racism. And a lot of this points back to beliefs that are not necessarily solid in their foundation. And I'm going to just tell you straight up front that a lot of the things that I share with people on this program, in the book, on TV, on radio, wherever I happen to be, might really call for a challenge or reassessment of what people believe they think they know. And the topic or the issue of how blacks landed in America is no different. Of the roughly 12.5 million Africans shipped to the New World during the transatlantic slave trade, fewer than 388,000 of them actually arrived in America. In the late 15th century, the advancement of seafaring technologies created a new Atlantic region that would forever change the world as ships began connecting West Africa with Europe and the Americas. Native populations were decimated. The transatlantic slave trade began primarily due to the native labor force being so diminished, and with the growing need for plantation and mining labor, the transatlantic slave trade was begun to fill this void. The slave trade was actually conducted from the year 1500 to the year 1866, shipping more than 12 million African slaves across the world over 400 years. However, the majority of them, 4.9 million, found their way to Brazil, where they suffered incredibly high mortality rates. By the time the U.S. colonies came involved in the slave trade, it had been underway for about 200 years. The majority of the 388,000 slaves arrived between the years 1700 and 1866, representing a much smaller percentage than most Americans realize. It is also worth noting that President Thomas Jefferson outlawed the importation of slaves in 1807, meaning that the last 59 years of the practice of importing slaves was illegal, and those that continued to do so were in fact criminals. Here's where the narrative gets a little dicey, and I want to make sure that I'm clear about this. Because ironically, it was a black man by the name of Anthony Johnson, who himself once had been a slave, that would be recognized as the nation's first legal slaveholder of record. I'm going to pause right there. It's very important to understand that slavery, as we understand it from a historical perspective, was not something that was codified in law. It was just a commonly accepted practice, a practice that people just took for granted. You had the slaveholding of African Americans, Chinese, some Irish, some other minorities. But this was just something that was done primarily through the ideas of indenture, people that wanted to travel to the United States for whatever the reason. Probably the same reason you're looking at a caravan to our south. But you have to understand that it was not something that was written into law at this time. However, it was indeed a black man that caused it to be written into law. His name was Anthony Johnson. Johnson was a former slave himself, and he sued for the legal right to hold indefinitely another black man by the name of John Casser. Here's how the story unfolds. In the mid-1600s, John Casser was an indentured servant in Northampton County in the Virginia colony. He was in service to Johnson, who was a free black, which is not unusual in the North at all. In 1653, Casser filed what became known as a freedom suit, claiming that he had been imported for 7 or 8 years as an indentured servant, and that, after attempting to reclaim his indenture, he was told by Johnson that he did not have an indenture contract. According to the civil court documents, Casser demanded his freedom. Johnson's son-in-law, wife, and 2 sons persuaded Johnson to set John Casser free. Casser then went to work for the English colonist, a guy by the name of Robert Parker, who, along with his brother George, would later testify that they knew Casser did indeed have an indenture obligation to Johnson. In 1654, Johnson brought suit against Parker for detaining his servant, John Casser, saying, quote, he never did see any indenture, but that he had, and this was the wording of the time, ye Negro for his life. In the case of Johnson versus Parker in the court of Northampton, it upheld Johnson's right to hold Casser as a slave, since there was no proof of the arrangement that Casser had and claimed that he had with Johnson. In ordering Casser returned to his master for life, the court both declared Casser a slave, sustained by the rights of free blacks to own slaves. So in a legal sense, the first owner of a black slave in the new America was, in fact, a black man. Again, bear in mind, there is no law making slavery legal prior to this case. It was simply a common practice, so the court's ruling legalized the holding of slaves, which is why Johnson, again a black man, is the first man to own a legal slave. There were, all across the country, despite what the history books might show or teach or claim, free blacks across the young nation. This is probably one of the most misunderstood and revised teachings from history. Yes, some blacks did own slaves in colonial America, such as Anthony Johnson. But what many Americans do not realize is that the practice continued well into the mid-1800s until the abolishment of slavery. Through films such as Gone with the Wind and others, Hollywood has successfully portrayed the practice of slavery as much more widespread than it actually was. Simply put, slaveholding, even in the Deep South, was simply not as common as history books, movies, and activists would lead us to believe. For example, according to the United States Census report for the last year of the Civil War, there were nearly 27 million whites in the United States, and about 8 million of them lived in southern slaveholding states. The United States Census determined that there were fewer than 385,000 people who actually owned slaves, and even if all the slaveholders had been white, that would only be about 1.4% of the total white population of the entire country, or about 4.8% of whites in the South owning one or more slaves. Also, according to census reports on June 1st, 1860, there were nearly 4.5 million blacks in the United States, with fewer than 4 million of them living in the southern slaveholding states. Of the blacks residing in the South, 261,988, according to the United States Census, were not slaves. Of this number, 10,689 lived in New Orleans, Louisiana alone. The country's leading African-American historian, Duke University professor John Hope Franklin, reports that in New Orleans, over 3,000 free blacks owned slaves. This is 28% of the free blacks in that city. The majority of slaveholders, both black and white, owned only between 1 and 5 slaves. The majority of these working as house servants, as nannies, not the necessarily tortured field hands that are often portrayed on the big screen. I want to pause here and make certain that I do not diminish the tragedies and horrors of those that were held in captivity, because it was true. It did happen. It was harsh. But it simply was not as widespread as the, film industry and some books would have you believe. The few individuals who owned 50 or more slaves were confined to within the top 1%. The majority of slaves held in the Deep South were either house servants or nannies. In 1860, there were at least 6 blacks in Louisiana alone that owned 65 or more slaves. The largest number was 152, which were owned by a Mrs. C. Richards, who was a widow, and her son, P.C. Richards. I would like to point out that, and I mentioned this in other places in the book, I mentioned that Mrs. Richards was a widow because she would not have been allowed to have owned property at this time had she been married. But as a widow, she was considered single, legally speaking, ergo she can own the plantation as well as the slaves. They owned a very large sugarcane plantation. There was another slave magnate in Louisiana with over 100 slaves. His name was Antoine Dubillet, a sugar planter whose estate was valued in 1860 at around $264,000. That year, according to the United States Census, the average wealth of Southern white men was approximately $3,978, while it was actually higher for those that were free blacks in the region. And while the travesty of forced slavery, especially in plantations in the South, was indeed real, harsh, and at times inhumane, again, it was not as widespread, nor was it exclusively a white institution. It might also be worth noting that once the emancipation of blacks occurred, free black men were granted the right to vote long before white women. Yes, inequality was fairly rampant in the early days of the nation, but was not restricted exclusively to the population, the black population in the United States. Now, here's where the narrative really gets quite interesting. Yeah, it was an American colonial court that legalized slavery in the 1600s in the new land, but it was also an American colonial court that helped pave the way for the end of it. There has long been a thought that it was illegal to teach blacks to read, although being discovered in doing so would get you in a lot of trouble. The rationale behind it was because of the Constitution of the United States of America. And a lot of people have laid claim to the fact that it did not apply to blacks in the early years, and this is simply not true. Her name was Mum, M-U-M, Mum Bet. She was a slave that was also known domestically as Elizabeth Freeman. She had the courage to face her master in a court case in Massachusetts, in a case that would turn up the volume on the debate of whether liberty and justice for all meant just that. Sometime in the 1770s, Freeman was sold to a Colonel John Ashley. Freeman was also oftentimes abused by the colonel's wife, so she eventually fled and refused to return. She had often overheard Ashley and his friends discuss the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, and she began to wonder why the statutes set forth in those documents should not apply to her. So she enlisted the help of Ashley's friend, an attorney by the name of Theodore Sedgwick. In 1781, Sedgwick initiated the case of Brom and Bet versus Ashley, in which he argued for Freeman's freedom using the Massachusetts Constitution, which stated that all individuals were born free and equal. The jury agreed with Ashley's argument, and the case set a precedent for the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts. Remember, this was occurring a full 100 years before the U.S. Civil War. In 1781, Bet was granted her freedom and 30 shillings in damages. And while Mum Bet's case would be a precedent ruling that will be debated and referenced for years to come on the road to universal emancipation, and although entirely speculative, had more slaves followed Mum Bet's lead and sued for their freedom, the U.S. Civil War, which again began some 80 years later, might not have ever occurred. This is not to suggest that slavery was the sole impetus for the war, but it did play a significant role. And it's also possible that the resistance to slaves being taught to read may very well have been that slaveholders feared that their property would learn that they did in fact have rights some U.S. courts would uphold. Of course, this depended upon the state in which the court resided and whether or not a high court would agree to hear the case. But it is in fact interesting that we have seen throughout history that there was a lot more rights that were bestowed than a lot of people might realize. And it was people that were like Mum Bet in this case that took it upon themselves to make substantive changes for the purposes and the good of all. There's been some debate over the Compromise of 1877, which essentially the federal government pulling Union troops out of the Deep South, and what impact that might have had on disenfranchising blacks in that region. But it's a very, very, very complex argument, and one that is quite fluid in terms of the impact that it would have had on this portion of the country versus other portions of the country. In this case, blacks were making an awful lot of progress. One example is Hiram Revels. Now, interestingly enough, today is the anniversary. The 12th day of December is the anniversary of the second black senator in United States history. His name was Joseph Rainey of South Carolina, and it was on this date in 1870 that he becomes the second black U.S. congressman, Hiram Revels being the first. Hiram Revels was born on September 7th, 1827 in Fayetteville, North Carolina. He was a minister who, in 1870, was elected the first black United States senator by the state legislature, which was how U.S. senators were elected at that time, representing of all states the state of Mississippi. He served for a year before leaving to become the president of the historically black college, Alcorn Agricultural and Mechanical College. Debate has surrounded Revels' eligibility to serve primarily on the 1857 Dred Scott decision, which excluded African Americans from holding office. The decision was effectively reversed by the ratification of the 14th Amendment after the Civil War. Democrats had argued that Revels did not meet the 9-year citizenship requirement to hold congressional office, giving his ineligibility for citizenship during the war years. But ultimately, Revels and his Republican allies prevailed, arguing he was eligible based on his mixed-race background. Revels' election to Congress was particularly poignant in that the seat that he was elected to hold had previously belonged to Jefferson Davis, the president of the now-defunct Confederate States of America. It's also interesting to note that a good majority of blacks in this point in American history were, in fact, Republicans. It was during these years, from around 1700 into the right about the time of Reconstruction, the end of Reconstruction, which would have been around 1877, 78, that the country was grappling with what it wanted to become. Much of the debate about civil rights begins right around the conclusion of Reconstruction, which again was just a very arbitrary date in the late 1870s. What we want to do now is take a look at some of the people in this country that made some of the biggest impacts on the civil rights movement and or shed light on what this nation was grappling with. This particular list is by no stretch of the imagination comprehensive. I simply, for the purposes of time and typing, had to choose people that I thought a lot of folks would most enjoy learning about. We, up to this point, realize that the discussion over free blacks and slavery, the legalities and the legal rights and the judicial system as it relates to blacks was fluid, and it was also inconsistent. There were some states that would hear the Mumbet cases. There were others, and they would have definitely been in the Deep South, that refused to. When the Republican Union North withdrew from the primarily Southern Democratic South, many things changed for the life of black Americans. And one can make the argument, certainly, not for the better. Best known for her role as Mammy in Gone with the Wind, Hattie McDaniel was the first African American to win an Academy Award. Though she got flack for playing Uncle Tom type roles, McDaniel fought for the rights of blacks to own homes and was active in community service. Ironically, she was not allowed to attend the premiere of Gone with the Wind because she was black. She died in October of 1952, having broken yet another barrier for blacks, winning the Oscar, though she was prohibited from publicly celebrating that victory. I want to stop here for just a moment and turn our attention towards Uncle Tom. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. There was not one person that was Uncle Tom. However, she is thought to have used the life and times of one minister at that point in time as the inspiration for what Uncle Tom would become. Calling Hattie McDaniel an Uncle Tom type should have been somewhat of a compliment, because the inspiration for Uncle Tom, he was very strong. He was a pastor, but he was also a pacifist, and he understood long before Martin Luther King ever comes on the scene, he understood what the fight was all about, and he took it to the streets. Harriet Beecher Stowe portrays that character as someone who is weak and vacillating. And while that may very well be so in the book, it is not in the reality of the life of the inspiration for Uncle Tom. He was a very unlikely and illegal hero. Who are we talking about? During the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, African-American sailor Doris Miller broke the rules to defend this nation and attempt to save the lives of U.S. servicemen. That fateful day, Miller was working laundry detail when the Japanese Navy fighters attacked. As Japanese fighters lay siege to the unsuspecting U.S. fleet, Miller sprung into action. First, he reportedly carried wounded sailors to safety, including his own captain. Then, during the heat of the attack, Miller spotted an abandoned Browning .50 caliber anti-aircraft machine gun on deck and immediately decided to man the weapon. Though he had no training, Miller shot at the enemy aircraft until the gun ran out of ammunition, and by some reports, possibly downing as many as 6 Japanese Zeros. What makes Doris Miller's story so incredible is that during this time, the U.S. Navy was segregated. Sailors of color like him weren't allowed to serve in combat positions. Instead, they worked as cooks, stewards, cabin boys, and mess attendants. They received no weapons training and were officially prohibited from firing guns. For those that have perhaps seen the movie, it was the character, and of course we're talking about the attack on Pearl Harbor, the movie Pearl Harbor. It was a character played by Cuba Gooding Jr. That was Doris Miller. Due to his heroic act in March of 1942, Representative John Dingell from Michigan introduced a bill authorizing the president to present Miller with the Congressional Medal of Honor. Senator James Meade introduced a similar measure in the Senate. While Miller did not receive the Congressional Medal of Honor, he did become the first African-American sailor to receive the Navy Cross. Doris Miller died a hero almost 2 years later on December 24th while serving on the Liscum Bay when it was struck by a Japanese torpedo. Miller's parents learned of their son's death on December 7th, 1943, exactly 2 years to the day of the date that will live in infamy. Miller was posthumously awarded the Purple Heart, the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, the American Defense Service Medal, the Fleet Clasp, and the World War II Victory Medal. There is also a frigate in a neighborhood on the U.S. Naval Base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, named in his honor. It's the contributions of these people that have made such an amazing impact on the fabric of this country. Many people over the years have asked me what my inspiration was for doing this podcast, for covering these issues on a radio program, and writing a book, Unknown America. My inspiration was a young lady by the name of Claudette Colvin. For those of you that have been long-time listeners to this program, you've heard me talk about Claudette Colvin. Every time I talk this story, I get some kind of pushback, but it's true. Before there was Rosa Parks, there was Claudette Colvin. Despite her obscurity, Colvin was a pioneer of the African American Civil Rights Movement. On March 2nd of 1955, it was actually Colvin and not Rosa Parks that was the first person arrested for resisting bus segregation by refusing to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. For many years, Montgomery's black leaders did not publicize Colvin's pioneering effort, fearing the optic that because Colvin, who is just 15 years old and has some reports have claimed possibly pregnant by a married man, might tarnish the movement, Rosa Parks was chosen instead. Words like feisty, mouthy, and emotional were used to describe Colvin, while the older Parks was viewed as being calm, well-mannered, and studious. This story touches me on so many levels because there are historians that have attempted, and even filmmakers, and we've got some audio, that have attempted to write this record. Did Rosa Parks refuse to give up a bus seat? Yes, but Rosa Parks was also working for the NAACP. It was an organic event in the life of Claudette Colvin. It was not so much as it relates to Rosa Parks. She became the face of the Montgomery bus boycott. I have had, for the longest period of time, a lot of problems with the United States or the American news media and those that claim to want to get the facts right. The entire reason this book exists is because of my desire to correct the history. It was completely within the rights of the leadership in Montgomery, Alabama, to put forth the best face and efforts for the Montgomery bus boycott and, by extension, the civil rights struggle. However, I will not give a pass to a culpable media that simply refuses to acknowledge the truth. Rosa Parks is no longer with us. Claudette Colvin, however, is. Today, it is the 12th day of December 2018. On the 11th day of December 2018, yesterday, I spent 15 minutes on the phone with Claudette Colvin. Whenever I do research, I really do research. Now, Ms. Colvin is unable to join us today, but we talked for a while. She currently lives in New York, and she will be joining us on a future edition of this program. She's not remotely bitter, and quite frankly, she's a very affable woman. She's getting on up there in years, though, so a little bit slow coming off the plate, if you know what I mean. But a lot of historians have tried to write the record. And one independent filmmaker even has produced a movie, which I don't even know if it's been released yet. It's a short feature called A Letter to Claudette. Here's the trailer for the movie that this historical and historian filmmaker has produced to show you, to demonstrate to you the accuracy and veracity of what I have just shared with you.
Claudette Colvin?
Yes.
I don't think that's a good idea. Why don't you move and let Miss Marjorie have this seat?
I'm sitting in my right section. I am not moving.
Move!
And I'm going to tell you one more time. I am not moving. This is my constitutional right! This is my constitutional right!
Rosa understands what's going on here. She works for the NAACP. So I truly want to ask her if she would give John some space.
Now, I realize the last part of that audio trails off. There's nothing I could do to fix it because it was historical audio. There's only so much you can do with that. But it was actually a pastor that was making the comment that she works for the NAACP, and do you think that she will agree to be the face of the movement? And it was indeed a movement. And to give you a little bit of idea as to how historically significant this is, there has just been an awful lot of debate as to how effective it was, but I don't know if a lot of people understand how it hit the city of Montgomery, Alabama, and how organized this effort was because of what Claudette Colvin started. Here's a little bit of a historical documentation just to give you an idea of how unbelievably impactful the Montgomery boycott was, the bus boycott, and how well organized it was to make sure it was a success.
Before the boycott, 2/3 of the bus riders were black. After December 5th, there were almost no blacks at the segregated bus stops or on the buses. They walked, and they created a complex system that used private cars to carry thousands of people each day.
We asked for persons who had cars and would voluntarily put them in the transportation pool to let us know and what time they could be used. And in that way, we could know when we would have cars and where they had to go to pick up people. People would call in and say, I'm out here on Cloverdale Road in such and such a block, and I'll be ready at such and such a time. But this was being done all through the day, and we would know what time they were supposed to be picked up and where they were.
It was really surprising because we thought, well, maybe some of the people would continue to ride the bus. But after all, they had been mistreated and been mistreated in so many different ways until I guess they were tired, and they just decided that they just wouldn't ride.
So the Montgomery bus boycott makes a much greater impact. It's much more complex than a lot of people realize. And again, this because of the efforts of Claudette Colvin. Because of the social norms of her time and her youth, the NAACP leaders worried about using Colvin to symbolize their boycott of the Montgomery bus system. Rather, they opted for Parks, who did refuse to change seats on a Montgomery bus. And although after Claudette Colvin and even others before Parks, it is worth noting that Rosa Parks was also, at the time, again, secretary of the NAACP and a known political activist in Montgomery, which, despite her contributions to the cause of civil rights, does cast a somewhat different perspective on this event than the history books have fully detailed. Over the years, although she does not speak out frequently, Claudette Colvin has, in fact, made comments to the media that, for whatever the reason, just don't seem to gain a lot of traction, despite the fact that after the arrest of Colvin, the headlines appeared in the New York Times, papers across the country, including the Montgomery Advertiser, and they were simply ignored. But nonetheless, she was asked in a recent interview about her thoughts on those times. As you know, we discussed, she's 15 years old. She's a mouthy, feisty girl. That's what you hear in the movie trailer. But in the words of Claudette Colvin,
that day when the bus driver asked me to get up, I had this feeling come over me. It felt like Harriet Tubman was holding me down. Hands were holding me down on one shoulder, and Sojourner Truth hands were holding me down on another shoulder. And I was glued to the seat, and I could hear the white passioners saying, she gotta move, that's the law, she gotta move. And I felt like this is my time to take a stand for justice. My name is Claudette Colvin, and in 1955 I refused to give up my seat to a white passenger on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, 9 months before Rosa Parks. I was 15 years old. And the rule and the segregation that a white person had to sit in front of you and you sit behind them. And so the bus driver asked me to get up. I was shouting, it's not constitutional right, so I'm not going to move. And that's when the policeman dragged me off the bus. Most people ask me, weren't you afraid? Well, I was a teenager. I was afraid, but I was more angry at these white passengers.
And before there was Claudette Colvin, there was Elizabeth Jennings Graham. In the 1850s, horse-drawn streetcars were a popular mode of transportation in large cities like New York. These privately owned vehicles could deny service to anyone and for any reason. It was Sunday, July 16, 1854. Graham was running late to church and boarded a streetcar. The conductor ordered her off the car, but she refused. Eventually, a police officer removed her from the streetcar. Graham's story inspired African-American New Yorkers to stand up for their rights and fight against racial discrimination in public transportation. The story received national attention, especially when Graham filed a lawsuit against the streetcar driver and the Third Avenue Railroad Company. Her lawyer, interestingly enough, was a fellow by the name of Chester A. Arthur, who would later go on to become President of the United States. In 1855, Graham won her case, and the court declared African-American persons should have the same rights of access to the transit system. As a result, the system in New York was desegregated by 1861, 100 years before Colvin and then Parks refused to give up their respective seats on buses in Alabama. And again, history has taught us that the American courts have, in fact, stood tall for the rights of blacks when given the opportunity to do so. And the person probably most responsible for teaching people the methodologies that are the most successful when it comes to having debates of racial equality in this country, obviously you're going to hear Martin Luther King. Few people know that on a hot Wednesday in August of 1963, before 250,000 Americans, Martin Luther King Jr. improvised the most iconic part of his I Have a Dream speech. Standing on the top of the National Lincoln Memorial, Dr. King's remarks would conclude the Civil Rights March on Washington. As King stood at the podium, he pushed his notes aside. The original speech he had written just the night before was more political and less historic, according to Clarence B. Jones, and it did not include any reference to dreams. After delivering the now famous line, "We are not satisfied and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream," Dr. King transformed his speech into a fiery sermon. On stage near King was singer Mahalia Jackson. Jackson reportedly kept saying, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." And while it is not known necessarily if he heard her, if he did, it was likely the inspiration he needed, as Dr. King then immediately continued, "Even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It's a dream rooted deeply in the American dream." And King preached on, adding repetition and outlining the specifics of his dream. And while the improvised speech was not considered a universal success at the time, today it is considered one of the greatest speeches in American history. And again, significant portions of it extemporaneous. Some other little-known facts about Martin Luther King. His birth name was actually Michael. He was born on January 15th, 1929 to Michael and Alberta King In 1934, his father, who was a pastor at Atlanta's Ebenezer Baptist Church, a church his son would later pastor, traveled to Germany and was inspired by the teachings of the leader of the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther. As a result, King Sr. changed his own name as well as that of his 5-year-old son. King was also a very gifted student, which allowed him to skip grades 9 and 12 before enrolling in Morehouse College at the age of 15, the alma mater of his father and maternal grandfather. Although he was the son, grandson, and great-grandson of Baptist ministers, Jr. had no desire to enter the ministry. King's I Have a Dream speech was not the first time he spoke at the Lincoln Memorial. 6 years earlier, he was among the civil rights leaders during the prayer pilgrimage for freedom on May 17th of 1957. King delivered his first national address on the topic of voting rights to an estimated crowd of between 15,000 and 30,000 people. The assassination in Memphis was also not the first attempt on his life. He narrowly escaped an attempt a decade before on September 20th of 1958. At the time, King was in Harlem signing copies of his new book, Stride Toward Freedom. He was in a department store when he was approached by a woman by the name of Izola Curry. The woman asked if he was Martin Luther King Jr. After he said yes, Curry responded with, "I've been looking for you for 5 years," and then plunged a 7-inch letter opener into his chest. The tip of the blade came to rest alongside his aorta, and King underwent hours of emergency surgery. Surgeons later told King that just one sneeze would have punctured the aorta and killed him. King's last public speech foretold his death. He was in Memphis in 1868 to support the strike of the city's black garbage workers, and in a speech on the night before his assassination, he told an audience at Mason Temple Church, quote, "Like anybody, I would like to have a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I've seen the promised land, and I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as people, will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." Less than 24 hours later, on April 4th, 1968, at 6:01 p.m. Central Time, Michael King, also known as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., would be shot to death by James Earl Ray on the breezeway of the Lorraine Motel. There is so much more, and there's so much more in the book, and there's going to be so much more on this podcast, because I really love talking about the unknown America that so few people pay any attention to. Things such as the narrative of Rosa Parks and Claudette Colvin, and I'm not trying to besmirch the character of Parks. She did what she did. But there's other people out there that deserve credit, and it's important to realize in that case, but a lot of the things that we're taught about this country, a lot of things that we think we know about this country are simply just not factually, well, they're not factually accurate. Does it matter? In some cases it does. Does it matter that Betsy Ross didn't sew the first flag? No. It's probably not life-altering, but there are a lot of narratives that the national news media will press into service that are just not fair with talking about the history of this country. And when I speak of history, the 1700s or the 1800s, the reality of it is that there's history all around us every single day. And if we're not going to respect the history of this country, if we're not going to respect the contributions of the Mum Betts and the Elizabeth Grahams and the Claudette Colvins and the Charles Drews of the world and so many others, I've still got pages and pages and pages of people that I want to share